Yogurt.
Did I hear something?
Apple, yes, it popped on. It said something here.
Oh, let's see, what is it? So,
They don't have a voicemail to do that.
I don't think we want the mic on.
If I
So this is the Section 111, Minnesota Point update meeting for the public. So this is one of 3 scheduled meetings under the contract with Barr Bergman Joint Venture, the contractor who's doing the modeling for the study. This is really the heart of the study. So if everything doesn't get answered today, you'll have 2 more options and other public options to get info. So the people in the front are people who have been closely involved with the study for over 2 years now. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves along with their role in the study. You would start, please.
I actually have not been involved in the study for 2 years, but I'm part of Barr Engineering and in the office down here in Mount Park. My name is Nicole Peterson and I'm a commercial engineer, water resources engineer here.
I'm Peter Hink with Barr Engineering. I'm the project manager for us on this modeling study.
I'm John Swenson. I'm technical advisor to the city.
Jim Sullivan. I'm a coastal engineer with Corps of Engineers in Detroit.
Jim Philby Williams, I'm the city's Director of Property, Parks, and Libraries.
Jesse McNinch. I'm a coastal engineer with the Detroit District.
I'm Captain Sam Briscoe. I'm a project manager with the Corps of Engineers out of Detroit.
Paul Troyer, park planner, coordinating MP 50-year long range planning.
Don Buck, Park Point Community Club President.
I'm Ben Sheets with Barr Engineering.
I'm Kate Kubiak. I'm the city staff person who's been serving as a liaison. We also have Carrie Fox with us here today. She is, say your title again, Carrie.
Public Affairs Specialist with the Corps of Engineers Detroit District.
Yes, so she is going to help facilitate the question part of the agenda, and you can see at the end of every section we have left in for questions. How many people are online, Allison? Okay, so in the interest of avoiding the mute, not mute drama that we all love so much post-COVID, I'm going to ask the people online to submit your questions in the chat. If that doesn't work for you, we'll still ask for your questions. Carrie and I have talked about that over, how that would work, but it will help smooth the meeting if the people online. I think that's all. Our Director of Property, Parks, and Libraries, Jim Philby Williams, is now going to give a couple introductory comments. We do have a seat up here. We have one by Corey, and we'll try to find a couple more.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome to this Minnesota Point Section 111 study update. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and give special thanks to a few folks. Park Point Community Club, led by Club President Don Buck, and represented by many of you in the audience today. Thank you, Don, and thank you, Park Point Community Club members, for being so thoughtfully engaged in stewarding the future of this precious asset, Minnesota Point. We want to thank Minnesota Wisconsin Point 50, led by Paul Troyer. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to all those who have been participating in that visionary initiative to imagine and realize a resilient and sustainable future for the point. Thanks to elected officials, particularly City Council President Randorf. Thank you for making this work a priority for a number of years now. And finally, just want to thank our Army Corps of Engineers partners for their support of this meeting and for all that they do to make Duluth such a wonderful place to work and visit and live. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to give you an update on this ongoing federal study that is designed to do a few basic things. The Section 111 study should cast light on the causes of the chronic beach erosion problem on the north end of Minnesota Point from the lift bridge to around the S-curve. It should confirm whether the federally owned Duluth Port entry infrastructure has contributed and is contributing to the problem. Moreover, the study is intended to quantify the portion of that problem that is attributable to those federal structures. And finally, at the tail end of the study, the intent is that the study will select the remedy or set of remedies that will most effectively alleviate the beach erosion problem in a manner that is both cost effective and environmentally responsible. As so many of you know, the proximal genesis of this study was the frightening and destructive series of Lake Superior storms that we had in 2017 and 2018, at the tail end of which our partners at the Park Point Community Club formally asked the city of Duluth to make a request to our congressional delegation and to our Army Corps partners to conduct a Section 111 study, in hopes that this study might get at underlying causes and might produce a durable solution. I think it's important to put this in historical context. There is, how many folks live on the point? Yes. In the best case, this would be a deeply unsettling and anxiety-provoking situation that threatens your homes, your health, your neighbors. Those stakes are compounded by the frustrating character of historic efforts to get at this problem. So this isn't the first Section 111 study that has been conducted in partnership by the city and the Corps. This is the third. And so the first was about 50 years ago. The second was about 25 years ago. And in different ways, for different reasons, neither of those studies was altogether successful. And what that has meant for our Park Point residents is an additional 50 years of uncertainty and fear and anxiety. And as we enter into this new third study, additional anxiety that this time we must get it right once and for all. And so one focus of the meeting today will be a methodological exercise that the Corps and their contractors are going to be undertaking that will be critical to the final results of the study. And that's the modeling exercise that they will be undertaking. We and the Corps and our partners badly want this to succeed. We don't want to be back here in 25 years with part 4 of this effort. And that means asking some hard questions. And one of the areas of concern for the city is to make sure that the science that is brought to bear on this question and the approach to modeling that is brought to bear are appropriate and will give us the answers that we're seeking. And so thanks to our partners for being here to present on the study and the modeling methodology and to field hard questions from us about how to make sure that this third effort succeeds where others did not. With that, I'll pass the baton to the city's science advisor, John Swenson. He's a UMD professor who has done research on this problem over many years and who we have engaged to help make sure that the city's work is informed by the best available science. John?
Thanks, Jim. I'm actually gonna stand. People hear me okay? Great.
No.
Are we gonna-
John, I just want to note that this is being recorded, so if you want to watch it later, you can. Okay. Sorry.
Giving you a warning of.
Yes.
Also, if you're standing, there's 2 seats here, one.
I'm suffering from a little bit of hearing loss in my left ear for reasons I don't know. Probably just getting old. But as a result, I don't know if I'm shouting or not. So let me know if you can't hear me or if I'm speaking. All right. So Paul, Don, and Jim thought it'd be a good idea if I gave a very quick overview of kind of Minnesota Point 101 with the purpose of establishing a framework for our colleagues from the Corps and BAR to continue the discussion in their components of the presentation. So I'm going to try to very quickly run through the what, why, and when aspects of Minnesota Point without getting too far down the weeds if possible, okay? And that's the first bad side. Oh, that is, okay. All right, magically, things work. So is it just a big sandbar? And the answer is yes, you can get away with that, but it's probably better to refer to it as a barrier complex because by invoking this terminology, you open up a vast literature of previous work, research on similar features all around the world. In particular, in this case, I just illustrated it with Galveston Bay. You'll notice what I did here. I flipped the point around to geometrically matched up with Galveston Bay. These are essentially very similar features. And by identifying things properly, we can begin to understand things better, okay? In particular, when we have a barrier complex, there are two things we need to make it. One is a rise in sea level or lake level. And the second, perhaps unsurprisingly, is we need a supply of sand. So I'm gonna pinpoint these two aspects here over the next few slides. For our barrier complex, Minnesota-Wisconsin Point, which I will just refer to as Minnesota Point from here on, no offense to our colleagues and friends from Wisconsin. Our barrier is made primarily of sand with a fair amount of gravel, particularly in the north end. It's relatively devoid of mud, which tells us a lot about how it was formed. Again, this literature that's available on barrier complexes tells us a great deal about how they behave. In particular, they are net depositional or constructional features. So even though our focus here today is on erosion, it's important to remember that the feature overall is depositional. It is a constructional feature. They're dynamic geologically, they're ephemeral, and again, their formation requires a lake. I want you to notice the homogeneity along, it's hard to see, I apologize, the contours aren't very clear. But if you look at the bathymetric contours out here in front of Minnesota Point, you'll notice that they're essentially parallel to the point everywhere. I mean, it's a system that is essentially the same along. So we can look at one cross section through it and gain quite a bit of information and apply that knowledge along the extent of the point overall. So the next slide, I'm going to show you some impossible to see from the back though results of ground penetrating radar transects. This is kind of CSI type stuff, where basically electromagnetic energy is bombard sediments with electromagnetic energy, and we look at the return signal. So this is work done by my colleague from UW-Eau Claire, Harry Joel, and his students. And what you are looking at is a cross section about 25 meters down into the subsurface across the point by the old soccer fields in front of the beach house. Okay, the edge of the harbor is right over here. The lake shore is a little bit out of the image over here to the right. The material on top, the yellow lines and this sort of mess up here on top, that's fill. That's artificial material that's been brought in. Ignore it. The currently exposed barrier is this area that I've highlighted over here in red. Okay. So I really want you to focus on the green curves, which are very difficult to see in here, but these features are what geophysicists call reflectors. You can think of them as surfaces of equal time. And in this sense, older surfaces are over here to the left, younger surfaces are over here to the right. Okay, this is a little bit like tree rings. Okay. Older features to the left, younger features to the right. And what we can infer from this internal structure of Minnesota Point is that it's a constructional landform. It's about 10 meters thick, roughly speaking. It's building out or has been building out on top of older sediments that are genetically unrelated to Minnesota Point. And the climbing features that you see in these timelines reflect an increase in lake level. We're going to talk about in just a minute. And behind it, so buried under the soccer fields now, are older beaches that are now submerged in the harbor, except for they're covered with fill to make a soccer field. Okay, so that was the what. How about the why? Why did it form? We need two basic ingredients. We need a supply of sediment, which we get from rivers, number one, and from bluff erosion, number two. We also need a rapid, in a relative sense, and sustained rise in lake level. Just to be very clear, this is on a geologic time scale. This is not the annual or the decadal fluctuations we see in lake level that impact the system so much in our day-to-day lives. This is a longer term rise in sea level. So let's do that part first. What's contoured here on this map, here's Lake Superior. What's contoured is the rate at which the Earth's crust, think of that just as the bedrock around us, is rising, rebounding, in response to having an ice sheet taken off of it about 10,000 years ago. And you'll notice that here in Duluth, we are actually sinking at about 1.5 millimeters a year. So feeling a little down today, that might account for it. If you drive to the east, though, and get over around Sault Ste. Marie, the crust is actually rising about 1.5 millimeters. Right? So the lake level is set, at least for about the last 1,200 years, by the elevation of some resistant bedrock in the St. Mary's River. That sets the elevation of Lake Superior. So if that bedrock's going up at 1.5 bucks a year and that's sinking similar amount, if you take the difference of those two, that's 3 millimeters in differential uplift. That causes the lake surface here to be rising at about 3 millimeters a year. And it's been doing so for approximately the last 1,200 years. The point to take away from this is that everything you see today, Minnesota Point, the harbor, those features would not exist without the rise in lake level. It's central to everything. So here is let's connect a few more pieces with lake level. Here is a lake level time series constructed by my colleague Andy Breckenridge at UW Superior for about the last 5,000 years. And the last part here reflects that rise that I just talked about. Okay, the earlier part reflects a fall and steady lake level. And the upshot of this is we can answer the question, when did Minnesota form? How old is it? It's about 1,000 years old. And it came to be basically when the outlet to Lake Superior changed and lake level began rising quickly. Okay, so moving on to basically sediment source, we have sediment coming from rivers around the western arm of the lake. We're not worried about mud for the most part. I'm sorry, back up. Sediment's been supplied to the system from small rivers for the last 4,000 years. That's unchanged. Originally, before sea level started to rise, we got sediment supply from the St. Louis River Basin and the Nemadji River Basin, but those are no longer in play. So it's shut off because of lake level rise, so those are no longer contributing. We have bluff retreat. We have erosion of sediment supply from erosion of the bluffs. On the south shore, it's very fast. It's about 50 centimeters a year. Some of you may have seen images like this in NVIDIA. On the north shore, we have a slower rate of erosion, but a substantial amount of erosion at 5 centimeters a year. Again, bluff erosion did not really, it's not a major player early on before lake level started rising. 1,200 years ago, when lake level started rising, bluff erosion became important. That's a picture of my backyard last night, 35 feet, bedrock in here. It's erosion. This material gets into the lake and in the lake shore and western arm and is then mobilized during large cyclones, where it is carried in longshore currents by northeast winds towards the Duluth Superior area. So there is a large convergence of sediment into this area that then gives rise to what we today call Minnesota Point. Those winds produce circulation in the lake that has this sort of pattern. So currents directed to the southwest on both the north shore and south shore, and then a return current up the center of the lake. These currents transport mud again, we're not particularly interested in mud, we're interested in sand, and the two as that form barriers, but associated with these currents are currents in the very near shore that transport gravel and sand and give rise to various system problems. So I have some additional slides. They're more detail oriented on North Shore sediment supply. I think I'm going to hold off on those for maybe later on in the discussion. So I would be happy to answer any questions at this point about the kind of 10,000-foot view of how Minnesota Point came to be, why it is like it is today.
Question, just raise your hand. If you want to hold it for later, that's fine. If there's any questions online, please put them in the chat or unmute.
Yes.
Am I correct that the North Shore, things used to have a much greater amount of gravel?
That is absolutely correct. The north end of Minnesota Point is actually cored by gravel and cobbles. And that gravel and cobble material, which again is not just in the surface, but also in the subsurface, extends approximately 2 miles to the south, down around the S bend. And that is, just to follow up a little bit, indicative of Minnesota Point being created, at least in part, or being fed, at least in part, by material from the North Shore, in addition to material from the South Shore.
That's part of what has changed with the having structures for navigation.
I think the North Shore sediment supply and the South Shore sediment supply, in the sense of sediment coming to this general area, that's unchanged. The question at hand is, are the federal structures trapping that sediment upstream or updrift, or are they allowing it to pass through and maintain?
Any other questions at this point?
Is the rebound rate expected to gradually decline over time, or do we know?
Yes, the what's called the e-folding time, or the half-life, if you will, of that process is about 10,000 years, so.
Not worry then.
Don't lose any sleep over that.
No questions online at this point, so I think we can hand it over to Captain Briscoe.
Yeah. Thank you. Give her a second to swap out the slides. Slide back here so you're not. But like we said, I'm Captain Sam Briscoe. I'm the project manager for this project. I work out of the Detroit office. And this is the outline for our discussion. I do have on the line with me Tom Resch. He's our contracting officer's representative, and John Love is our lead planner for this meeting. And then also Bridget Roan is on the call. I am leaving this project in about a month. Bridget is taking over for me. Bridget, do you want to say hi real quick? Or no, she's muted, isn't she?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. I'm not sure if my camera's working, but I think I might have turned it on. Good afternoon. My name is Bridget Roan. I'm a project manager with the Corps of Engineers in Detroit. And so I'm getting up to speed on the project and glad I'm able to join and look forward to working with you all on this.
Bridget's one of our senior project managers. She's been in the Detroit district for several years. She's also spent some time in the European district in Germany. So she's seen a lot of USACE. She knows what she's doing. You guys are going to be in good hands with her. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks. Thank you.
So most of these slides today, not the first public meeting I've done with this group about this project. So you probably recognize a few of these slides. The purpose of this 111, this project is being done under the CAP 111 authority. CAP is Continuing Authorities Program. 111 is meant to look at changes that can be made to federal programs, specifically in this case, how the federal structures for the entrance to the Duluth Harbor are affecting erosion along Minnesota Point. So the purpose of this project is to determine how much erosion is being caused by those federal structures. Develop recommendations for how to correct that erosion and design those mitigating structures or efforts that can be implemented jointly by the Corps and the city of Duluth in the future. I'm not working now. All right, here we go. Thanks. So the purpose of this is to build a prevention or mitigation process that will prevent migration of material along the shore. Yeah, that's really all I want to hit on this. Okay, so you've all seen this, you're all familiar with Minnesota Point area. So right now, at this phase of the project, we have brought in Barr Bergman, their contractor. They are developing a model, and they're going to talk about that in much more depth later, but they are developing a model, the purpose of which is to allow USACE to determine what percentage, well, I'll back up, to allow USACE to determine where material is coming from and where it is going. So beach material, where it's headed, where it's coming from. And from there, we can determine how much erosion is being caused by the two federal structures. Once we have that this percentage of material is being, or this percentage of the erosion is caused by federal structures, we can then enter into a cost share agreement with the city of Duluth to create that mitigating structure or program. So you will hear when a USACE representative is talking about this project, we may be talking about mitigation efforts that we will build in the future. Barr is only concerned with this model. So essentially mapping out where material is coming from and where it is going. So I wanted to make sure that that is clear to you all what portion they are working on. And that way, if there's a difference in what we're saying, that's because they're a little more focused in scope. So here's our current schedule. As you'll notice, well, this column was the schedule at our last public meeting, and this is the current schedule. So you'll notice there has been some slip in our schedule. This was due primarily to, it took longer to bring Barr on as a contractor than originally planned. At the beginning of the year, when we had the continuing resolution, when Congress did not pass a overall budget for the year, we did not receive funds to continue this project for the year. We were able to keep working off of funds from last year, so it didn't stop the project completely, but we didn't have enough money to bring Barr on. It wasn't until our CAP program manager managed to get some money from another project moved over to this project that we were able to bring Barr on. That's what caused a lot of the delays in this schedule. I apologize for that delay. The effect of working with the federal government, and I apologize for it. And I'll talk about that later. If you have any questions about 111 authority or cost share or schedule, we can talk about that now. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to our contractors, Barr Bergman.
A couple of questions. In the previous meeting I attended that we presented, there was a plan that we were going to do dredging last summer in order to get data to put in the model. Did that dredging occur?
Yeah, Bridget, we did do dredging. Wasn't talk. Okay, I know what you're saying. We have dredged this year, and we are. I don't know what the state for that. I'm not the project manager on the dredging. We were not dredging. If what you're referring to, we were taking samples from the beach. That did occur. Dr. Seligan was out. He was the one running that. He came out 2 or 3 times to do that sampling.
Last fall, we collected probably 120, 130 samples from the lake bed. And then we collected a whole bunch of samples along Minnesota Point maybe 20 or 30. We collected bluff samples from Duluth all the way up to Two Harbors to get an idea of what sort of sediment is coming in and how much sand is in that play. Same thing on the Wisconsin side, from Superior over to Fort Wayne. We collected about 10 samples also. So,
Thank you. I didn't know if you've gotten the data, but whether the funding mag had messed up.
No, that did get affected.
I have a question, Jim. What was the, how was that sampling and the report on that relevant to the new model that's coming out that will be developed? How was this, how will that study relate?
well, the big, like the accounting tool that gets used in this sort of a study to look at what role the Federal Harbor plays in the erosion out there is a sediment budget. So we need to know how much sediment is coming into the system, how much sediment it is moving around the harbor, is being lost offshore. So we need to be able to account for all the sediment coming in and leaving the system. So the sediment for the eroding bluffs is obviously a very important piece of that. So we've been in our lab, we've been removing the clay and calculating what percentage of that sediment is sand or gravel, the beach suitable material.
There's one other thing that use the sediment size to help guide the sediment transport model as well. So they're driving, moving it around with waves and currents. They need to know how big it is. Cobble, sand, mud, whatever it is. So the samples will use that manner.
So is there a report available to share what the outcome of the study was?
There's not a report yet. I finished or folks in my lab finished the samples about a week ago. So I've got a spreadsheet that's mostly populated, but I still need to add some metadata and stuff like that to it. So within maybe a month, I'll have, it won't be a self-contained report, but it'll document the methods we use with the data, and I'll pass that on to BAR for incorporation into the setup budget.
Question up front.
Yeah, I was listening to the project manager, and I guess Bridget, the new project manager, and Dr. Swenson kind of explained that, you know, this is an erosion problem, but the course seems focused on erosion, but it's really a depositional problem. Like the structures are preventing deposition. And so I'm just wondering, is that clear? Because the scope that you described only describes the erosion and it's not describing the deposition. Is that clear that that's?
Yeah, so we are looking at.
Is the language written into the stuff? So you've narrowed your scope that you're just looking at erosion?
No, we're not.
Of course, the piers aren't causing erosion as much as they're preventing the deposition.
Yeah, so we are looking at what is being caused by the federal structure. So I apologize if I wasn't clear on that.
Is the federal structure, are they the piers and the piers alone?
Yeah, there's some, like, it's just the piers, right? Well, that's all we're looking at. I don't know any other federal structures out there.
Just the dredging, I mean, change the flow of the river and that. By building the structure and and continuing to dredge that exit for the river water from the harbor. I mean, is that being considered? Maybe BARs can answer that. Are you considering the alter, you know, how it alters the flow of the water out?
I think ultimately it's going to be a question of the sediment budget. And as you're talking about, you know, what parts of the sediment are moving where in the system? And Ben's going to talk about that more when we get into the conceptual model of the system that we're going to be using to develop that model.
We are just looking at how the system is now, not historically, or, I mean, there are some scenarios for the future, but.
How do you, if you don't look at historically, how do you know what's happening now?
We'll take the sediment budget, figure it out.
We have a question up here.
Yeah, we're aware of some of the samples taken right on the Minnesota Point for surface on the beach and lake. Were there samples taken at depth to verify the original kind of coarse sediment was coming down? It's now buried by years of dredge foil having been placed over it. Kind of get a sense of what historically was able, the energy was able to transport to that point. Have you
Yeah.
sample of depth?
So all of the samples we collected were superficial grab samples. So we didn't core down to get at what's below there. So when we collected those samples, the model that Bar is going to present on shortly, the purpose of that model is to move that sediment around and figure out, is our harbor blocking 50% of it? If it is, then we're responsible for 50% of that sediment blockage. Is the harbor shuttling some of that sediment offshore to deep water and lost? That would be on the federal government too. Or is some bypassing? So those sort of things will be sorted out in the numerical model, and the numerical model is only going to move. There's an active bed in numerical model, and the numerical model is not moving sediment 3 meters, like 10 feet below the ground. So
That was not the point of my question.
Okay.
Historically, the energy of the lake has been able to move large cobble. And by sampling what is now buried by sand would provide you good evidence of what the lake was capable of moving before the barrier was in place. Wouldn't that be important to calibrate your model to those particle sizes at depths that have now been buried? Not that they're going to be moved again, but that you will be able to move if the barrier were not there or somehow replaced by bypass.
yeah, the sediment budget is looking at today though. So it's looking at what the sediment supplies are from the bluffs today, what the sediment supplies from the rivers are today, and how much of that is getting interrupted by the federal structures today. So that's the constraints of this modeling exercise.
Forgive me if that's already been covered. So is it the issue that is the natural currents coming from the North Shore and from Wisconsin are being interrupted such that what would be typically deposited on Minnesota Point is actually being deposited further out in the lake, and therefore we're not rebuilding or replacing the.
I think that is a better question for once Bar starts talking, but it is an assumption that the federal structures are blocking sand from moving, well, material from moving in.
But it's being carried by currents anyway. Is it just ending up further out in the lake?
I'll let Bar cover that a little bit later.
But yeah, Ben is gonna be explaining our model next. I think it'll likely do a higher level overview of what we're looking at, and then really ask him some good questions after that.
Any other questions at this point? I'm not seeing any online.
I guess it will come up under the modeling questions, but yeah, how will the, millions of cubic yards of dredge flows put on affect the model? And how will that factor in? So I'll wait till y'all can comment on that. That's my question. How can we consider the lake forces from 153 years ago when the land has been, greatly altered? How do we factor all of that in?
And I can talk for just the first couple minutes and you can do the thinking.
Sure.
So again, I'm Peter Hinckley, I'm our project manager helping coordinate our efforts. This is a joint venture between Barr and Bergman. Go to the next slide there.
What works best to point on to make this advance?
Oh,
There we go.
I think you skipped one though.
Oh, did I? Sorry.
So this is kind of an overview of what Ben is going to talk through. Primarily focused on a high level overview of our modeling work plan, the stage where we are in the project with the Army Corps at the moment. We were brought on in mid-March to start this project. We've been going through literature review and data gathering for the last several months and building our modeling work plan. That modeling work plan is under internal review now and is going to be going to the Army Corps shortly. And we'll be working through the specific scenarios that will be modeled. And so what Ben is going to present on is kind of a high level overview of the information that's going to be in that work plan. Let me go to the next. Just to make a point that we are part of a larger team working with the USAID's Detroit district, including a number of the folks that are here. Ben and Nicole and I are highlighted there on the left-hand side of the screen. We have a number of our other colleagues from various bar offices and with our partner Bergman helping us with this project as well. I guess with that introduction, I'll pass it over to Ben. Ben is our lead coastal modeler, has done a lot of work on other projects in the Duluth area in the estuary, and is very familiar with the conditions here. So take it away, Ben.
Sounds good. Is that enough build up, do you think? So I'm gonna back up one to go back to this outline slide here. I'm Ben Sheets from BAR, as Peter just said. It's really exciting to be working on this, to be able to have the chance to kind of build this model that gets us a better understanding of how everything's moving around at this end of Lake Superior. And where we're at in this process right now is really kind of conceptualizing and developing a plan to build that model. We have not built the model yet. We have a plan of how we're going to do that. That's what I would like to present you today. Obviously entertaining questions as they come up while we do that. And what that sort of developing that plan looks like involves a number of steps. It involves taking some time to sort of look at what types of previous studies, in particular the previous Section 111 studies, consisted of, what that work was like. Doing some of our own data gathering and literature review and developing our understanding and sort of conceptual understanding, what we like to call a conceptual model, not a numerical model, just a concept model of how things work out there. What are the important processes? What are the major sources of sediment and sinks of sediment? And then with all of that in hand, we're in a position to go about actually developing a numerical modeling tool. The intent of which is to help us be able to predict, as a function of different types of lake levels. We all know Lake Superior moves up and down on a daily basis. How that can affect sediment movement on Minnesota Point, and how really how the budget works for all that sediment. What's coming in, what's going out, what effect the structure is playing on that budget. And so just going to walk through sort of a slide for each of those things here. This is the previous studies. Just as placeholders, I have sort of the cover pages of, on the left, the 1974 study. That at that time, obviously 50 years ago, as someone's coming in. All right. Now we're, oh, this, I like this, this thing right there.
Conceptual.
Right, that is kind of conceptual, isn't it? The study on the left, the earlier one, a lot of that was sort of an understanding that was developed based on review of historical shoreline positions. There wasn't a lot of actual sort of modeling done with that. There were some computations in there, but a lot of it was just based on review and understanding of what had been done, where they interpreted the shoreline to have been at different periods in time. The study on the right from 2001, the 25-year-old one, as Jim pointed out, did involve more modeling. And the structure of that report looked a little more like what we're undertaking now, where the modeling was done as part of an appendix to the larger Section 111 report. And that's really our role. That's the piece I want to talk about here is what that hydrology, sediment transport modeling piece of this study looks like. When it comes to how that gets used as part of the broader study, that's really more the scope for the Corps to discuss. But I just wanted to provide that context. The final thing I want to say on this slide, and again, as Jim pointed out earlier, is 2001 is a fairly long time ago. And especially in the context of the types of computing power and modeling techniques and data that are available to us now that simply weren't as available in 2000. I mean, they made us do, John and I were in grad school at one point and we did computer modeling back then, but it looked pretty different than what's available to us now. So what we get to do now is update that with more modern techniques, assuming I can make this piece of technology what it's supposed to be. I don't know if maybe I'm not clicked on the, there we go. Okay, so step one of that was kind of this data gathering and literature review piece. So this is just a high level slide here that we, obviously shows the western end of Lake Superior from a pretty, distant perspective. We're seeing a lot of the western end of Lake Superior here. And just highlights in a number of different places some of the important types of information data that we need to make sure we're paying attention to as we construct and undertake this modeling effort. So that's going to include everything from several laser on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there it is. Everything from information about the waves that are happening out here in the deeper part of the lake to as John showed, the currents that those waves and the transport of water and the surface associated with the waves set up in this part of the lake. Obviously, we need to make sure we're characterizing the shape of the lake or the bathymetry, the depth, as well as we can. We need to worry about the fact that waves out in the deep part of the lake are pretty different than waves once they start to feel the bottom of the lake up closer. So we got to incorporate that and understand what are we seeing from these, in this natural system out our front window here. We need to pay attention to what the shoreline's made of, and that's where the sediment sampling study that Jim mentioned comes up. We can use some of that information in terms of what these shorelines are made of to help put in the model, proper characterization of what that material is like. If it's sand, it's a little bit harder to move than mud. And if it's mud, it's easier to move than cobbles and those kind of things. And that's information that goes into this sort of modeling effort. We want to make sure we're parameterizing all of this, not only the shorelines, but the bottom of the bed and Minnesota Point properly, so that the things that should move, and the things that don't move, don't. And then the final thing I'll point out on this slide is this green dashed line that's a little faint to see, and it goes behind this blue box over here, but comes around, that's roughly the extent of the model domain we intend to work with. So we want to create a hydrodynamic model that covers enough of the lake out here that it's generating and making waves that translate all the way down into the harbor towards Minnesota Point. I always want to say Park Point, but Minnesota Point, and is able to affect these shorelines and set up those transports along there for sediments and things like that.
So it's all on the lake side. There's nothing in the model on the bay side.
Right now, that's the plan, yes.
And why?
Well, conceptually, at this planning point, we are thinking, again, I keep using the word conceptually, but conceptually, that the things that are happening in the harbor aren't really affecting, except in as much as sometimes sediment is dredged out of there, or sometimes small amounts of it come out the rivers. The processes that are happening on the backside of Park Point aren't very important to the front side right now, which is what the primary concern is.
Because the erosion rate study done in 2020 shows considerable erosion on the bay side too. So you're saying you're not taking that into consideration?
Well, that's good feedback, right? In this plan, no, but I'm not aware of that particular study off the top of my head, so I can't comment intelligently on that. But that would be an important element to consider if in this process of developing the model, we decide that's a key pathway. Yeah. Okay. Can you just advance the slide one for me, please? I don't know why this. This is basically the same as the previous slide, just a little bit more zoomed in. To point out a couple of additional types of data. In particular, we need to worry about the fact that for certain periods of the year, ice is part of the story here. During those periods, how the waves interact with the shoreline are different than when there is no ice. Yeah, as we were just talking about, here's that model boundary again, and the idea is to run this roughly along it again, at least right now, along the crest of Minnesota Point and not worry about the bay. That said, we may, as we develop this model more, decide that we want to bring the boundaries a little bit more inland and include some of those behaviors. So those last couple of slides are sort of talking about particular types of data that we're pulling together in order to develop this understanding. And then that all together kind of synthesizes into a bigger picture. And this is sort of a cartoon almost of what we like to call a conceptual model or conceptual site model. And several things are indicated here. It's not everything that could possibly influence the point, but it's certainly the major things or the major things that we've identified to this point, and really all previous studies have identified that are affecting how the point forms, evolves, and behaves every day. So there's a few things. White arrows on here are meant to sort of indicate primary sediment sources. And we've already talked a fair amount about sediment coming from the South Shore, sediment coming from the North Shore. As John pointed out, there are river sediment sources, but at this point, due to the rising lake level and other activities that happen on the Nemadjias and in particular damming of the St. Louis, the sediment supply from those two rivers is almost negligible, at least to get out into the lake. There are, and this gets at your question from before in terms of dredging, dredging and placement of those materials on the beach. That's another potential sediment source at various times through the. I didn't even touch it. That's through the course of the evolution of the bar or the feature Minnesota Point. There are times when it's been supplemented with dredged sediment, and that there are periods where we need to make sure we're considering the effect of that and how they might be changing the morphology of the beach immediately after and in a longer term sense after that. Orange arrows are meant to sort of imply places where sediment can go. There's a few different places. Obviously, the waves as they sweep up and down can bring sediment from the south part of Minnesota Point to the north. They can bring it from the north to the south, variously depending on what the particular storm or set of storms or years, decades of storms are looking like. Similarly, those storms can serve to take sediment offshore, bring it into deeper water through undertows and those kinds of currents. Just as certain times of year, certain kinds of wave events bring sediment more back onto the shore. And those are all potential sources or sinks of sediment that we want to make sure we're considering as we develop this overall approach. And then finally, some of the major processes that we need to make sure that are very relevant here are the fact that this is about 30 years of Lake Superior record here from 1990 through roughly present day. And these are feet on the left axis there. You can see that the lake, obviously, you have sort of decadal climate signals, you have annual seasonal signals, you have even shorter daily signals associated with swashing of water back and forth in the lake. And then all of that superimposed on the longer term trend that's a bit harder to see on this short of a plot. But if we showed the entire record, you'd see the more geological record that John was talking about of a few millimeters a year of rise rate of the lake on the whole. So this type of variability needs to be factored into what we're considering, because if the water comes up a foot or 2 feet, that moves where the waves are attacking the shore. It brings it closer in. And if the water goes down, similarly, it moves where the waves are attacking further out. So where that's happening and at what time periods, that all matters here. Waves are driven by wind, so we have to make sure we're grabbing good wind records. This is from the airport on Park Point at Sky Harbor there. This is what the distribution of winds for the last 20 years looks like. It's mostly out of the northeast and out of the southwest. I know those are small numbers. We don't need to read and understand all the details, but the point is you need to take into account the actual local winds. Hidden behind the teams thing here is nothing super important, but there's ice. Again, we need to make sure we're dealing with the fact that at certain times of the year, ice is keeping the waves from doing the same thing that they'd be doing right now or in the summer. And then I already mentioned this, but obviously deep waves are different than shallow waves, and all of that, the reason for building a model that covers as much of the lake as we do is to make sure we're capturing that transition from deeper to shallower waves and how that's affecting both longshore drift on the shores, North and South Shore, but on Minnesota Point itself. Go ahead.
2 things. One, whether your model anticipate regular addition of dredge spoil sediment to the model? And secondly, will your model be constructed such that it determines the fate of the spiner grain materials that have been used on the beach? Where does that go, since it doesn't stay? It's going somewhere. Will the models determine that fate?
I'm gonna take the second part of your question first.
Okay.
Yes. The model is designed to deal with sediment transport, and one of the fractions or size classes that will be considered is finer grain sediment. We can ultimately parameterize that however we want. We could use every single grain size under the sun that made sense. Typically, that's not done because you can characterize fine grain sediment movement with a particular grain size. You can characterize coarser grain sediment with a particular coarser grain. And you minimize the amount of sweat the computer has to go through if you do that smartly and efficiently. So to answer your question, yes. We can anticipate that fate with that fine grain sediment as being transported offshore. The model will do that.
To refine that, will you be able to determine the depth of wave action that can continue to move sediment, or when it is no longer accessible by wave action at depth?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I appreciate that you're looking at winds and directions and course over the last 20 years. But after the last 3 to 4 years, the winds with climate change and whatnot have become more forceful, and the waves have become higher and stronger. Historically, in '86, the lake level was higher than it was in '17, and yet there was virtually no serious damage done, right? 17, 2018, there was a lot of damage done because of the waves and the happening that.
In short, yes. So the reason we built a numerical model like this is it gives us a way to represent the best and the worst of natural processes. Right? And so part of this exercise, again, still in planning, so I can't tell you exactly what scenarios will be run, but part of doing this and setting up and developing these scenarios in consultation with the city and with the Corps is to identify these kind of, in our world, we call them design events that we want to worry about. And one of the questions that does need answering is if there are periods of time where things look exactly the same, but there's not as much erosion, why is that? We need to understand why that is, right? The ultimate goal is to create this sediment budget for what is happening at Minnesota Point today, or this year, let's call it. And it doesn't, but that doesn't mean we don't need to consider those more extreme events that have happened in the past, or I suppose in the future, potentially, depending on how lake levels and things evolve. I saw a gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, just a quick question. Does the model incorporate sand moved by wind as well as wave action, or are you ignoring the wind part?
The two-part question. The model I'm talking about right now does not include aeolian or wind form processes. If as part of developing this sort of concept and our understanding of Minnesota Point, we understand wind to be an important factor with dunes that we know exist on the point. There are other tools that we would use to investigate them.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you were talking about looking at the deposition of where it's gone. A lot of my octogenarian Park Point friends can talk about when there was no dune here. So some of the sediments that you made in your model, if you're not looking at the wind, say went to the deep water, but they're actually piled up. So wind might be and it's very evident right now with the dredge spoil still being, you can see how that moves.
Right.
Different sort of question about the contract to create the model. You guys own it and simply give the results to the Corps. Does the Corps own it? Is it in the public domain and available for anyone to use once it's developed and created past a point?
I'm going to answer part of your question, and then I'm going to defer to Captain Briscoe on that. But we are going to use, I haven't gotten to this slide yet. Let's stop right there. I don't know if I'm clicking or who's clicking. We're going to we're gonna, well, we propose or we plan to use a combination of something. Potentially something to deal with Alien that is not gonna be listed here right now. But as far as the hydrodynamic part goes, we're gonna use a code and some associated modules of that code. It's called Delphi. This is an open source software. So it is the, you know, the science in effect that we're gonna use is a publicly available tool. So that's that part there, right? We're not gonna use a proprietary product that keeps it hidden. The various files and things that we intend to use to parameterize that model, we will deliver to the core, and how the core chooses to disperse them is up.
So when we contracted this, we specifically requested something that wasn't proprietary, something that would be public source. Once we have their data, that will be an appendix, just like in the last one. It will be in the hydrology appendix within the greater 111 report that will come out from this study. That report and all the data for that report will be public record, be accessible to whoever wants to look at it. Is there anything else I need to add to that?
No.
Okay.
Will it be like a subject to, like, when we were having discussions a few years ago about putting the dredge spoils on the beach, the answer was get a FOIA request and call, you know, your lawyers, call our lawyers. Is that what's going to happen with the 111, the data, when say Dr. Swenson's students want to study this? Are they going to have to get their lawyers to contact?
No, it won't be that difficult to get I don't think it'll require a FOIA request.
Yeah, before, that was the answer
111?
from the core. I don't know if it was,
I
here, maybe it was.
Very difficult.
I think we should make this easy. I don't know how we normally serve up data like that to the public, but we'll look into that and we'll make sure that the data from the study is easily accessible.
Yeah, we could potentially put it on the USACE digital library, make it accessible via our public website. But we'll work through that internally and make sure that everyone's notified.
Yeah, all along the selection of like the open source model and all of this stuff was done intentionally to make this so that John could take the model and run scenarios he wants to. Other academics, other contractors, if you want to use the model that we developed, go ahead.
Let me add too that the core did not develop Delph 3D or XBeach. And we did not direct BART which model to use. We specifically wanted to leave that open. But I'm personally thrilled that they chose those two because those are very good models that are used worldwide and have been vetted in the literature for quite some time.
So my question is, what is the deliverable? What did they ask you to deliver at the end of the modeling? What are you going to present to them? And then how will they use that information to come up with the percent responsibility of the federal structures to block these?
Okay, a big piece of our deliverable, aside from all the components that, sorry, I'm behind. Seconds. I mean, the components of the model and whatnot that we just discussed that'll appear in the appendix. That's a piece of the dream, right? But the other piece really here is that the goal of this modeling exercise is to develop what we're calling a sediment budget for the fund. And so I put that on this slide here again with my cartoon next to it to say, you know, when I first showed this, what I wanted to make a point of is that these are what a conceptual model is essentially a collection of hypotheses. We think that the South Shore sediment is important. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with me that that's true. And then, you know, there's a hypothesis that, well, this structure may be pretty significantly impacting the ability of the longshore currents to carry that sediment to Minnesota Point. Okay, the model we're going to use to test that, right? And we're going to be able to say that is a hose of sediment that is, you know, either limited by the entry or is getting some around the entry or whatever it is. And that's the outcome of the work, right? And then we're going to be able to balance that source, whatever sources there are of sediment that we identify with these other potential sinks of sediment that are taking things away or bringing them offshore or whatever the case, blowing them back into the dunes, whatever the case. Does that respond to your question?
I apologize for the dripping. I think we need a section 111 study on the ceiling situation, so.
I don't think I have the characteristics for this child library stuff. Okay, we're good for right now. Let me, oh, sure, go
I
ahead.
have one more question. I think it was already asked, but I don't know if I heard the answer. Living on the point, watching the dunes grow real fast. Okay, going upwards.
Yeah.
And that would be deposition of sediment.
It would, yeah.
Is that included in?
Well, so it can be. Let me, I recognize that sounds like an annoying answer.
Yeah.
The plan here that I'm trying to present right now is really to deal with the lake side of this. Now, let me finish. What I'm hearing from the people in the room here is that they're seeing a lot of wind-blown behavior on the beach that we should probably consider somewhat in our analysis. And so I'm gonna say with a lowercase y, yes, it's included. It's not gonna be included in this one big Delta review model. The reason is because the math around dealing with hail or wind transport of sediment is a little bit different. It doesn't really operate on the same kind of time scale that we're gonna be using to deal with the hydrodynamic. So it's, yes, it's a component of the sediment budget that we need to deal with. It's just not gonna be in this one big one.
No, I'm confused. I thought I understood. So a windblown model would have to be something in addition to what you're already contracted for? You'd have to rewrite a contract?
No.
Oh. Okay. So will you do windblown modeling?
I'm gonna say yes. We will consider wind transport as a component of our overall sediment budget here.
And that'll vary with particle size.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sediment transport always does. So yeah, 100%. The reason I'm hedging a little bit on it is that the way really for us to deal with wind-blown sediment is that it's going to be a handful of specific high wind events, particular times when there's availability of sediment. And a certain set of processes that aren't nearly as ongoing. I know it's windy every day, but it's not windy in the sense that it's moving all the sediment off the beach every day. Waves and longshore drift are really every day. So they're kind of a bigger story to understand than the wind. That said, we need to understand the wind's contribution to this picture as well.
On the question, which I thought was really great about the future conditions, so you're gonna base your model on the past 20 or 30 years of climate, but we know climate changing. The Minnesota climate projections that were just released have changes in temperature and precip in them, but they don't have wind projections. How will you predict those future winds if you don't have the projections?
So the scope of the model for this study right now is to consider present day, what the present day condition of things is. And it's to recognize that within present day, there's a lot of variability in terms of wind strength, wind speed, wave height, water level. And so to some extent, by investigating that kind of range of current conditions, especially nearer the edges of the bell curve of present conditions, we're going to get at some of those things. The goal of this modeling is not to say, what's Lake Superior going to look like in 50 years? That's a super important and key question. It's not this scope right now.
But any future impacts from climate change would be exacerbating the problem that the structures.
Well, potentially. But again, not the scope of this effort we're talking about right now. Now, when it comes further down the road and maybe there's an effort to just design mitigation, obviously that's going to have to factor in there, right? You don't want to build something that's not going to work in 30 years. But for this scope right now, no.
Hey, Ben, has your firms done a model like this anywhere else on the Great Lakes before?
Yeah.
Using these models?
Yes.
Most recently, where?
Well, most recently, right here. Actually, a lot of this area, all the way up to Spirit Lake. And we have it built all the way down through the harbor too. We've also done it, in Lake, Fort Marsh, which is in Lake down here. I don't know why I couldn't think of the name, like off the top of my head. Yeah, we haven't done it on Minnesota Point yet, but yes, we've done this in several different places in the Great Lakes and globally and locally here, just even in the estuary.
That include a barrier island like this?
Well, yes. I mean, there aren't many barrier islands like Minnesota Point.
Yeah.
But, well, John's shaking his head at me. We haven't done one in Galveston. No, I mean, the reality is, right, we don't do a ton of coastal work in other places because we're a Minnesota-based firm. But we have worked in the Great Lakes, throughout the Great Lakes, with the Detroit district, and we've worked on other coasts. This particular modern approach is used for coastal flood protection all up and down the West Coast too. Puget Sound, San Francisco Bay, the mouth of the Columbia River, all have these big Delta 3D models that I've worked with a lot of the guys who have built those.
Where else in the Great Lakes?
Well, the most recent one was this Ford Marsh in Lake Erie. It's on the west end of Lake Erie, north of Toledo. It was a shoreline protection issue there to understand, and habitat restoration issue there.
Let's go back to the slides and then we'll hold whatever.
Okay. Yeah, the truth is, we've mostly gone through these slides, but I'll hit a couple other ones just to get out there some of the things that we were going to mention. I mean, what I, as a whole, want to convey to you is that this is a proven, and I don't like to use this phrase, but it's a state-of-the-art way of dealing with coastal problems, is what we're bringing to this. And so part of applying that in the modern era with the kinds of computing power and things that we have now is to make sure that I've already talked a lot about different kinds of data, but this is just another example of a variety of those things that are going to have to be factored into making sure the model can account for. So I mentioned previously on the form of a map that we have to make sure we're getting, the best combination of NOAA depth maps, and then we also need to worry about the land surface itself, right? The model doesn't stop at the shoreline. It goes up onto the land to deal with the waves running up there or, wind potentially, right? Lake Superior water level, I already showed a version of this plot a little bit smaller. The water level variation in Lake Superior is way more complicated than the ocean, believe it or not. It's much more cyclical, driven by a variety of different weird things. The fact that it's a little smaller than an ocean adds some really interesting components about how storms push water around here. I mean, everybody's seen it when there's a big onshore storm event, the water comes up. That's the wind pushing water towards it. So we got to take into account that we're doing all those things properly. Like I mentioned before, we're probably going to include at the edge of this model out on a line kind of Two Harbors, Fort Wayne, give or take. We're probably going to need to make sure that we're taking into account the fact that big waves, well, I'm pointing the wrong way, are coming in from further out in the lake. Okay, the model will generate its own waves, but we can kickstart them at the edge of the model by making sure that we're using data on what those waves look like out there in response to different kinds of winds and storm events. Obviously, wind, speed, direction, temperature, all of those things matter here. Temperature really mostly only with respect to whether there's ice or not. Fortunately, water, it changes with temperature, but not enough that it matters really for what we're worrying about here. We have to make sure we're incorporating these sources of sediment either from beaches or bluffs along the north and the south shores. And then we've already mentioned this a couple of times, but we need to make sure not only are we incorporating those as sources of sediment, but we're parameterizing what those sediments are from. And that's, fortunately, Jim and his crew have put together, a really nice database that's very specific to this end of Lake Superior. It's going to be a great basis in which to build that build that into our model. So I quickly showed this slide. This, I mean, I've already said a lot of this in words. These are all things, these are all requirements we need to make sure the model takes care of in the upper left-hand corner here. The proposed approach is to use a combination of these things, possibly now with a little extra consideration for wind things that are happening on shore as well. And as we've talked about, this is a proven and widely used tool in academia, professional organizations, government organizations, literally all over the world, including the Great Lakes and Lake Superior. The point that I didn't really talk about, but I think is important just to mention here is, so this sounds all fancy, right? Like we can throw all these numbers at a computer and get the thing to do something. How do you know if it's right? Right. Well, that's where this stuff in the lower right-hand corners comes in. Fortunately, we know, we don't have perfect records of it, but we kind of know what's happened out here at various times, either from individuals' personal recollections or other kinds of published studies, John's and Andy's GPR studies, whatever they are. And what we can do with some of those types of data sets is go run our model with a particular set of conditions and see if it's reproducing something that we know did happen. And if it's doing that way too much or way too little, then we know we need to tune how we're running the model. So there's kind of two pieces to this. There's validating that the model is doing something that you know to have happened. And then there's a piece of calibrating the model to do that thing properly. And exactly what that looks like is going to ultimately depend a bit on what kind of scenarios we're running, exactly what model domain we set up, exactly which time periods we end up finding the most and most complete data sets for. But that's the basic spirit of how you convince yourself, you increase your confidence that the model is working.
When you've done other modeling, you said you did St. Louis and that, and you looked at validation. How predictive are your models? Image being your focal.
When you say how predictive.
Confidence.
You validated, how did that?
Yes,
I hate giving a number.
Range examination now, and we see if it rains or not.
You can do, so, okay, let me tell a story in part to answer that. We did a bunch of modeling up in the Spirit Lake area in association with the restoration of the steel mill up there. And it just so happened that when we were starting that work, it was during the time of that 2012 flood that came through. That messed up the zoo and messed up a lot of things. We had equipment in the water, a bunch of it got washed away, we never found it again. But one thing we found in the measurements we did get is that there had to be a certain amount of suspended sediment in the water in order to create the patterns that the model predicted. Or I said that in a weird way, but I guess where I'm trying to go with this is to say that we figured out that there had been erosion further upstream in Jay Cooke State Park that nobody had really noticed yet because the model was accurate enough to understand that the patterns we saw on the surface or the bed of the lake had to have had sediment that wasn't otherwise recorded. Did I explain that kind of okay? I confused myself saying it. And to give you a more concrete answer to your question, I think within 10% is pretty reasonable and often better than that. Now, it's much easier to, the problem with models is it's always a little bit wrong. Okay, I mean, nature is nature. It works on an atomic scale and does all these things. Every grain of sand does something. You can't put all that in a computer. So there's always a level of approximation that's involved in modeling. That said, it's a long and kind of rich scientific history of people figuring out how to optimize these things and get the best statistical answer that they can out of these types of systems.
When you say 10%, is that your model would be able to predict within the 10% plus or minus of reality? Or what, how do you mean 10%?
Yeah. Something like that, but it's going to vary on the scale of your model, what the process is. But we generally want to see our models doing something in that range to better. if we're, if we're validating against a specific historical event.
Would you be willing to add to that validation, third-party review? Peer review?
That's, I mean, I think to the extent that this work will be published in the appendix, all of our work will be available for that kind of review.
Question.
Well, I'd be happy to have people review it. It's not my call in this instance.
Maybe it's one to call.
That's why we have Dr. Swenson why the city hired him as a technical advisor. He's reviewing a lot of our work. We're going to go over with him later exactly what scenarios we want to run for these models. Like he's an outside person who's putting a lot of review into the work that we're doing right now. And we're glad to have him on the team.
But just as one final comment, I would be happy to have this review. If that's what you want me to say, yes. We don't intend to do anything
That
mysterious.
was my question. You would be happy. The question was, will you?
Yeah, well, within, John will certainly know everything we're doing.
Okay, yeah. Going back to the question that was asked about when the Corps took the samples up the shore, and somebody asked about digging down. I know Dr. Swenson has pictured the holes dug down, construction sites, and you can see the cobble, and so you can actually see what was deposited there historically. We can't, you can't test your model, see what would have happened without the structure, the pier structure, because it's there. And so wouldn't it be useful to look down and say, this is the type of material that was transported? If they've decided or taken the sample, so you say, oh, there's 2-inch rocks that are coming down the North Shore and that they would have been deposited. But if you don't know what's under the historical stuff, how can you could say, look, 200 years ago or 100 years ago, to say what would have been there. So isn't that important to know what's under there for that 2 miles of
Well,
cobble?
we do have cores from the original section 111 report. They took a number of cores going down Minnesota Point, and they were finding exactly what you're saying, gravel and coarser material in with the same. So we've got records of that. There's other records. There's well logs. Anytime somebody sinks a well, it has to get logged and turned over to the state. So there are records of what that material is.
Okay. Well, then this is really, there's only one more slide here that we haven't touched on, and it looks a lot like the other ones, but the words are a little different. But we've touched on this topic without being on this slide. The point here is to now, with our model that we feel is doing a good job based on the criteria we were just discussing, look at and evaluate, what's the difference in all of these arrows and things, depending on whether we're having a pretty nice day like today or during a big storm. For example, what happens when the waves come from a slightly different direction? What happens when the lake is relatively low, like 2012 versus relatively high like 2019? All of this matters, right? It depends on exactly, it dictates where the waves are attacking the shoreline. It dictates from what angle and at what magnitude the sediments are moving around in association with those waves. And so we need to develop a set, and as Captain Briscoe said, in consultation with John and the city and the Corps here, develop a set of scenarios that we're going to investigate, that we're going to use as the basis to develop this sediment budget. And then this sediment budget, to go all the way back to a question from whatever it was a half an hour ago, is really kind of the ideal end result here, right? We're going to have a picture of exactly how big these arrows should be, which ones are most important, which ones are less important, when and under what conditions those are important. And that lets us understand, how much of the historical sediment is getting there or not getting there, and start to move forward in terms of understanding what potential mitigation options there are to do. The modeling we're talking about here is not to design that mitigation, it's the understanding.
And then before we go to some of the ones online, go ahead, Paul.
Will the modeling show, well, first of all, it'll extend out how many years?
Well, that's part of scenario development. We haven't decided. I mean, so there's a trade-off here, right? In a perfect world, we could run 50 years of time. That's computationally very difficult. Just takes a lot of computers, a lot of time, and time we don't really have. Right? So the way you get around that is you identify these particular characteristics. You need to understand what they are, but identify characteristic events that are, a big storm from 2018, let's say, like Jim mentioned, is what's going on with that storm. And then you can extend your results further into time by saying, how often do we anticipate? How often does the record tell us that kind of storm might happen? And then you can use that to kind of extrapolate at some level.
And using that technique, will your model inform us in X number of years, how many structures will be affected if no mitigation takes place? Damage to personal property and infrastructure.
A tool like this could be used for that. That's not part of this model scope right now. Structures won't be explicitly included in this for one. And for two, again, what this effort's about right now is really to enumerate and describe all of these arrows and what the state of Minnesota Point is right now. This is a tool you could use for those types of studies, but it's not part of the scope. Okay. Yes.
Hey, one final question. Can someone explain exactly, we'll have a sediment budget. I'm saying we'll have a sediment budget. What is the relationship between the sediment budget and the percent responsibility from the Corps by the federal structures? Who makes that determination? Are they directly proportional, or what's the relationship between the sediment budget and the percentage of responsibility?
So once we see the sediment budget, like once we see this much is coming in from the North Shore, much is coming in from the South Shore, or not coming in. And then what is the total amount of sediment coming in? We can come up with that percentage. Is that answer your question?
Exactly comes up with it, and that's directly proportional. How is that number determined?
Yeah, the project delivery team. So our team of engineers at USACE will be the ones who determine that. Dr. Seligan would be a major member of that. Christian Smith. There's a few people who would contribute a lot to that calculation, but.
Yeah, I think the answer is going to come out of their sediment budget.
But that didn't answer the sediment budget, but she's saying, I think, is asking, like, we take the sediment budget, say that it's supposed to have 100 pounds of sand and sediment is supposed to get there, and with the structures, it's only getting 50 pounds. The structures are blocking that deficit in the budget. And so the Corps is gonna sit down with a bunch of Corps people and decide how much responsibility the Corps has, right? Or are there outside? This again comes down to peer review. I know you get a lot of academics here who'd like it peer reviewed, but is that all within the Corps? Is that gonna be a public document, or is that a process, or is that all the team gets together and then just puts out a number?
Well, we've got 2 more public meetings before this study, before you guys are done with the modeling part of the study. So there'll be other places to input. Now, they're gonna, when they construct a sediment budget, they will essentially have created everything that we're gonna need to make that assessment. And it's gonna be almost as simple as there are ways that sediment either gets trapped in the system or leaks out of it. So dunes, when the sediment blows inland and it gets trapped in dunes, that's a loss to the sediment budget. And by definition, if you remove sediment from the system, that's erosion. So let's say 20% of the sand in the system is being lost to the dunes. So that's 20% of the erosion that the core structures are not impacting. Maybe 10% of the sediment just leaks offshore to deep water and can no longer be used to build beaches. So that's 10% that's not the Corps' responsibility, because our structures didn't cause that leakage. That's a natural thing. If our structures are trapping, let's say 50% of the sediment, or they're somehow directing it offshore, then that's 50% at the Corps. So the sediment budget is our accounting tool that we'll use to come up with the percent that the two structures are responsible for the erosion.
So, and just follow up, this goes back to my concern when Captain Briscoe is talking about this being, it's just an erosion problem. When Dr. Swenson did his introduction, and thank you very much, it's really good. It's a living system. It does naturally erode, and in order to maintain itself, it's being fed a constant source. So when you say that the Corps is not responsible for the things that wash away or blow away, which also in that wind model, we have to consider that hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of dredge spoil, river sediment that's been poured onto the beach. It's not really the same sediment that's coming down. But anyways, it's a living system. So we're supposed to be losing a certain amount to the lake. And we're supposed to be losing a certain amount to wind. But no, that natural part isn't part of the structures. But the structures are preventing that resupply. So instead of saying how much of the erosion is, and this is why I focus on erosion, because you're just talking about erosion instead of this whole system. So the whole system is being starved. It's a starvation problem, not an erosion problem. And so what you're saying is you're not responsible for that outflow. Right? So I'm thinking more as that you're responsible for starving the beach to keep it having that system that was like in equilibrium before the structures went up.
Yeah, and because sediment is conserved, you can't like create or destroy sediment. If you're creating a starvation in one place, you're creating an accumulation in another. And the model will tell us where all these piles of sediment are, how big they are.
But the responsibility for starving is what the structures, the erosion is natural and it's going to occur. And like you just pointed out, the structures aren't responsible for that erosion. The structures are responsible for the starvation. And so the starvation on both ends, the point, but I know the scope is for the north end. It seems like when you say we're going to take off 30% of, just with using those hypothetical numbers you put out there, of our responsibility because those are natural erosion. It's really because you're at 100% responsible because you block the natural feeding of the point. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so
we got a bunch of coastal scientists here. It's not a living system that moves.
If we blocked 100% of the sediment, then we would be 100% at fault for the erosion on the other side.
Okay. Yeah. And so, but like you just said, if that stuff is being washed away and not being, you're just, in your previous comments just before that, you were saying that the structures aren't responsible for that.
Yeah, what happens, let's say we block 100% of the sediment at one of the harbors, like Superior, that was the finding from the 2001 study. You block 100% of the sediment. As this shoreline south of the harbor, on the other side of the harbor, is experiencing increased erosion, what it's trying to do is regain the sediment transport that it originally had. So let's say you've got 100 units of sand coming in, we block those waves on the other side have the capacity to carry 100 units of sand. So it's going to keep eroding until it gets back up to 100. And at some point along the point, when it's eroded enough, you're no longer experiencing an effect of the harbor because it's eroded so much that it's got that honey back. And so there will be zones along the shoreline where the harbor is responsible for portions of the erosion, and then other places where the harbor is just not having an effect anymore.
I'm not understanding.
I think we're defining erosion differently. So we're calling any removal, correct me if I'm wrong, any removal of sediment from the system is how USACE is defining erosion. And you guys, I think you're defining erosion as anything being removed from the beach.
I'm looking at percent of responsibility as how have the peers affected the system? How has the Corps of Engineers disrupted the natural system of the barrier island or the barrier system? And so, like you said, on the south, at the 100%. So you stopped feeding the point, and now you can see the results of that. And so that's why, but Dr. Seligman was saying that of looking for other things that are culpable for the erosion or for the, and that's what you used. You used just erosion and didn't talk about disruption of sediments, or you didn't talk about disruption to the system that creates the barrier. That's what I'm just wondering, when you talk about culpability, it's, or responsibility of the structures, that should be the focus, not the normal cycle on the rest of the point. It's that feeding of the system, the starvation, like you said, in 2001, that's what came up for. And that's why I'm concerned about the project manager, making sure that as we look at this, we're not just looking at as an erosion problem, we're looking at it as this disruption to the system that created the island and maintained, or not the island, but the Corps created an island, the barrier system. The disruption to the system, more than an erosion problem.
I think because the model has such a huge domain, it's covering the whole western, maybe what, third quarter of the lake, a large piece of it, that we're looking system-wide there. We're looking at how sediment is being recruited off of the bluffs into the system, all the way from Port Wing to Superior, all the way up to Two Harbors. That we recognize this is, like you said, kind of a moving target. It's a living thing that's always changing. So we're trying to capture all of those inputs of sediment to the system. And things do change. This end of the lake is subsiding. So as Minnesota Point sinks down deeper and deeper, that would appear as erosion, but it appears as if it's eroding, although it's actually sinking down into the lake. It's more that the lake is tipping like this, like the outlet is rising faster than Duluth is. So the lake level is rising.
Okay. Carrie, I'm sorry to interrupt. At some point, we want to transition to questions that have come in online. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the answer, but we'll ask them again just to make sure. But I do want to get through just a few more questions in the room that people have been waiting to ask. So in the back, there's a question.
Well, it seemed to me that take an aerial view of Park Point and Wisconsin Point, it's very obvious that Wisconsin Point is very large on their side of the Wisconsin canal. And Minnesota Point is very small and has had multiple beach bridge supplements to it. It doesn't take, to me, it doesn't make any sense at all. You don't even need a computer to figure out that sand's being blocked. It's not going anywhere to come onto Park Point. It's just being blocked. Whatever model you have, I don't buy the fact that you have this thing here, that whatever sediment's going in and out of the point makes that equal. Common sense would dictate that's not the case.
But there's one more question. Yeah. Was there an answer to that? I'm sorry.
I didn't hear a question.
Yeah.
Only statement.
Okay, I'll buy it. Yeah.
Were you looking for a response?
No.
Is it not intuitively obvious that the Minnesota Point exists because of the sediment that came from the north and sediment that came from the south long before the impediments were there? So that tells me that the lake was capable of transporting sediment all the way from the south to some point where it met the sediment coming from the north. Otherwise, there would have been a gap in the entire barrier island. So from the beginning, it seemed like the the theory should be that the sediment supplies were sufficient to nourish that entire, like 7 miles of beach. And whatever change took place then had to be the imposition of the blocks. I read the 2001 study that said the sediment only would go like 5,000 feet from the south end up, and none from the north past the barrier. We know that's wrong. But to assume that the sediment could not go several miles from both directions in order to build a continuous barrier island seems to me intuitively wrong. Does that not make sense that that island exists because the lake was able to transport sediment from both ends till they met in the middle?
I think that's the conceptual model that we all agree to, that sediment is coming from the Wisconsin side, coming from the Minnesota side, converges and has built the point historically.
Yeah, but the question is going to be how much was blocked? And it seemed if the whole island was built by sediment coming from the low, everything must have been blocked due to the core thing. So it's like a 60-40, but 100% core responsibility.
Pointing to the wind, say some of 10% got blown away. And that kind of thing. That's the concern, is that the Corps isn't taking responsibility for what's intuitive. Is it not intuitive?
Well, so let's pretend that Duluth and Superior Harbors were never built. If Duluth and Superior Harbors were never built, there would still be subsidence going on, right? You know, the point would be sinking. And
Go ahead, Dr. Swenson.
Rate is so slow.
I think the longer term evidence that I tried to present quickly in the beginning there suggests that the point, as we see it today, was able to keep its head above water during that, in response to that rise in sea level. It undoubtedly did not build lakeward as quickly, but it seems from its internal structure that it was able to maintain its lakeward growth, albeit at a reduced rate. So that would suggest to me that there's enough sediment in the system, and from the north and the south shore, perhaps with a little added on top from the river systems in the harbor, but probably not, to keep the system alive.
And those like ground penetrating radar sites were not taken just 5,000 feet. They were taken a considerable distance from either structure.
Correct. They were taken the one cross section I showed, again, that's not my word, that's Harry Joel's word, was on the correct.
I'm just concerned. The reason I'm asking this question is I'm concerned that we get this, that Barr does a really great job, and all of these scientists and coastal engineers do a great job, make a great model, and the Corps goes with the scientists like yourself, and then the politicians or the appointees. I don't know who else is in that room that's going to come up with that, and they come up with that. Well, we're 75% responsible. City of Duluth, you need to come up with several $1 million because to match that, and then the city won't have enough money to do it, and then nothing will happen like 25 years ago or 50 years ago.
Well,
In the spirit of meeting management, we have 15 minutes left. Anyone come here? Is it okay if we bump the solutions to the next meeting so that we can answer the online questions? The solutions are going to be decided once the modeling is done. So I think, are there online questions?
There are a few. Some have been answered already, just through discussion here. One I want to ask is, once the model is created, tested, and the project is complete, can or should the model continue to be used into the future for continued learning, perhaps by UMD?
Well, I don't, it's not.
On our side, the model files are part of our deliverable to the Corps. Where it happens after that, I guess is the Corps'.
But maybe it should be. You know, it will be a nice tool.
Our plan is to make all that.
Someone's got to do it.
Next question, how much is the model expected to cost?
It's 100% on the Corps.
That's public money. How much is it?
What was it? 600,000? Is that the contract?
Less than that.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you answer.
I believe our total contract is 400 and something thousand dollars. I believe. I don't have the number in front of me.
Yeah.
Next question, there's been significant loss of beach just west of the Superior entry. Will that area be included in the study?
Absolutely. Yes.
And I guess this kind of goes in line with some of the questions that were recently asked in the room. Is the primary reason for modeling to establish accountability amongst the governing bodies? And if so, how important is it to determining a solution?
From my perspective, one of the primary reasons of building the model is to quantify how Minnesota Point it works from a sediment transport, a wave dynamics and erosion, a deposition, a starvation and not. How that all works. That's the primary reason, because unless again, from my perspective, I'm not in charge of everything here. But the reason, we want to do that, right, is to even have a meaningful conversation about the next phases, you have to have a good baseline. Understand it.
Can you say the question again? I was about to ask for it, make sure I understood it right.
Sure. And for modeling to establish accountability amongst the governing bodies. And how important is it to determining a solution? And then there was another question, kind of similar. Is the main focus of the study to assign responsibility, or is it looking for solutions?
I'd say it's both. We have several potential solutions that we are going to look at. They are not going to model those solutions, but we need the data from the model. We need to know where sediment is coming from in order to determine which of those solutions would be most beneficial. So I guess the model is directly assigning, I don't remember how you worded it in the question, but directly assigning a percent or a volume to the different sources of material, both sources and how material is leaving. And then that data is necessary for coming up with a final solution.
I mentioned too, just because I know we have about 10 minutes left, we do have a box up here, so a lot of pens, pieces of paper. If you do have a question today that you did not get answered, or you weren't sure if it was heard correctly, make sure you write it down for us and leave it in the box so that we can make sure that we fully understand those questions, comments as well.
I'd like to make a comment that this meeting is extremely good. I appreciate what you're doing, but also demonstrate that 3 of these will not be enough. We can't get into the meat of this as we go progressively along, and then all of a sudden we're 2/3 or 2/3 of the way along, and then we're still having glaring questions. Would it be possible to modify the schedule to include more meetings and maybe a technical workshop type level rather than try to compress it into 2 hours?
I mean, that would require changing the contract up.
Contract changes are done all the time.
We'll work on having public meetings outside of the contract with them. That's just part of the city's role in this process anyway. And yes, 2 hours just goes by so fast.
And then in the alternatives, will nature-based solutions be a part of your consideration? Because I see that's part of the Corps' executive order from the Colonel and also from the White House. So when I saw the previous slideshow, I did not see a single nature-based solution on the table. Is that an error, oversight, or how did that happen?
Those solutions were developed during our federal interest determination. They are not a final list of what we could possibly do as solutions. Once we have the data from the model, we'll be able to, I'm hoping we'll be able to narrow down, which solutions we'll be able to use. And we'd be willing to receive, suggestions from the public if any of you have suggestions for.
Dr. Rep came out almost unanimously in favor of pump around to mimic nature-based solutions. And I haven't seen any more pump around.
Pump around was, do you want to pull up that slide? The pump around was on there.
That's it.
Yeah, it's definitely on there.
Well, that's great. Thank you, because I missed it.
Not that one.
I saw nourishment.
Last, there it is.
Oh,
Bypassing plant, first one.
excellent. So that's still gonna be one of the.
Dunes.
Can you model a bypass?
They're not modeling any of these scenarios, but we will see the data and then we can figure out how you can design a bypass to carry so much sediment.
And it could be modeled,
That's what I thought.
but it's part of the design phase for.
Are there any Wisconsin Point residents here?
So as we wrap up, why don't we maybe just take a minute to kind of talk next steps? Once, after this meeting is done, what the team will do in the next steps, and then maybe timing for next meeting. And we'll work with the city to try to get more meetings in there. Captain Briscoe, what's our next steps? What does the team do after this meeting?
Well, we need to sit down and determine what the scenarios will be that are going to be modeled. And then we'll allow Barb Bergman to begin modeling those scenarios. They're on contract for 6 models or 6 scenarios, I guess I should say. So we'll be able to, we'll give them some time to develop those scenarios and develop the outputs for those scenarios. Next time we have a meeting, I would like to go over those scenarios and probably won't have solution or final data from that, but at least discuss those scenarios that we've developed as a team.
Yeah, and I guess on our end, as far as the modeling contract and that work, as I said at the beginning, we have a draft modeling work plan that we'll be submitting to the Corps shortly for discussion and review and confirming those scenarios to be modeled, and then we'll begin actual construction of the numerical model. I'm looking at our project schedule currently has us working on that model development through the summer. And then, as Ben was mentioning, doing some initial modeling scenarios of validating against observed conditions. And we expect to be at that point in about the early fall, which is when at least we were thinking that the next public meeting here would be, and then move forward from there to modeling of those scenarios that you mentioned and the construction of the sediment budget after that.
And the 6 scenarios are?
We haven't determined them yet.
Oh.
That's the next step, is determining those.
Do you want to mention what you have planned tonight?
Yeah, the community club is hosting an informal dialogue debrief at 6 p.m. at Lafayette 3026 Minnesota Avenue. Everybody's welcome, 6 o'clock. We'll just talk about what we talked about here, maybe write some more questions and maybe work with the city on the next steps from our point of view.
So I wanted to point out, excuse just a second.
No problem.
But if you do have any comments, questions, you can use this LREPAO@usates.army.mil email address and send any questions, comments you have to that. You can also write them down, leave them in the box on the table. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, from the city's perspective, echo maybe one of the underlying common messages that we're hearing from our residents. Our residents have worked very hard over a period of years to gain a deep science-based understanding of the system as it originally functioned and how it has functioned since it's been perturbed by the federal structures. And I think, our science advisor, John has generally advised them and us that the existing research and data that we have in hand pre-modeling is sufficient beyond a doubt to say that the federal structures, are at very least a primary or the primary contributor to the land loss problems we've had on the north end of the point. And I think what you're kind of hearing from me and also from our residents is an anxiety that for whatever mix of reasons, the modeling may produce a result that diverges from what will be the results of your literature review. And we're not concerned about that in the abstract. We're concerned about that because that's what happened the last time. And so, to our residents who are here, we share that concern. We appreciate you asking those hard questions to say, for example, your question, like, is modeling even necessary? Well, we agree that it's necessary, but that's a damn good question. And we will, with Dr. Swenson's assistance, be reiterating those questions again and again and again, because if a year from now, what happened in 2001 recurs, that the modeling results point to little or no contribution from the federal structures, the corporate city of Duluth and our residents are almost certainly not going to accept that as credible. And so there's plenty of room to disagree about magnitudes. Is it 50%, 60, 80, 40? But I think, based on the 2001 study, it is altogether understandable, why our residents would have worry about this. And so I appreciate all of you airing those concerns and asking those hard questions, and you can trust that we will continue to do so as well. That is not to say that in any way we have anything other than the utmost trust in our core partners with whom we work on so many projects critical to the city. If the results were to divert from the existing body of knowledge, we presume that would be inadvertent. But we can't have third failure. And so thank you for all of the hard questions, and we hope we are representing your concerns here well today and in the future.
Your parking meters? Next time.
But
they didn't. Let's see. I don't know. Let's see. I'll go up to, now there's only 4 people. Well, there's 4 people still on. Oh, the recording. Okay, how much? There are no residents that live on this Wisconsin Point. It was well, how much is modeling exercise expected to cost? Here's a good one. No, they won't say how much. It's asked again. Teresa, they won't tell her. Or maybe they answered it in person. Yeah, I think we lost it. I'm sorry. I think, well, actually, when I turned it off, the screen was. Okay.
Not a problem.
That's why I turned